Mă bucur foarte mult să vă văd. Mulți din unii sunt și reșițeni pe aici, de care mă bucur tare mult. Și prieteni mai vechi și prieteni mai noi. Bună seara și bine ați venit. Pot să vă rog să veniți poate un pic mai aproape, măcar voi, așa? Dar să ne facem un pic mai intim și comos și să ne și auzim. Cum vă pică bine și vouă? Uite așa, Eliza, poate vine și Peri la tine. Am zis că e un prilej de a cumva încerca de a cuprinde gândurile. Ce am învățat de fapt în acest an? A fost un an întreg în care ne-am tot dat cu capul de termenul ăsta, de ideea de cover. Și am zis că o conversație în seara asta ne-ar ajuta foarte mult pentru a înțelege sau cumva, nu știu dacă neapărat a trage concluzii, dar a împărtăși, a aduna câteva din gândurile cu care ne-am confruntat în ultimul an. O să încep în paralel cu expoziția, care sper că inspiră, dar care știu că poate să și dezorienteze, sper că într-un mod sănătos. Avem și o carte care o să prezentăm la sfârșitul lunii în ultimul weekend. Și atunci ce vreau să fac e să citesc un pic dintr-un text pe care l-am scris pentru carte și din câteva piese, interviuri pe care le-am făcut pentru carte, pentru a crea un cadru de discuție. O să încep prin a prezenta 3 personaje, un muzician, un regizor și o psihanalistă, care vorbesc fiecare de noțiunea de cover din punctul de vedere al meseriei proprii, iar apoi vom face un scurt istoric al noțiunii de cover pentru a înțelege de unde vin cover-urile, unde s-au născut. Și o să încerc să explic și ce legătură are toată chestia asta cu arhitectura. First of all, thank you, Chris. Both Gabrielle sent a message earlier between Amanda leaving yesterday, Gabrielle's text message, and you. Now you're all very set on making me cry, and it's been moving. You know, they oftentimes say. I heard many people say that the idea that you actually learn from your students, it's not true or doesn't apply for them. But equally to what you said, I've been learning a lot from you and your colleagues present, and that's really been very meaningful. So thank you for all the hard-won lessons. Too many more, I hope. Okay, so we'll start with Benji B. One of the people that I interviewed for the book is called Benji B. He's a DJ, broadcaster, musician. He has an amazing show on BBC, which has been doing for 20 years. And he basically, once a week for 20 years, has just been playing music there. So when I asked him about covers, he says, there's one thing to get out of the way. Unless you're blind, you know that there's no architect making anything without a reference. And unless you're deaf, you know that there's no musician making anything without their unique thumbprint, marking their exact moment in the cosmos, all of the sound that they've ever absorbed. With covers, there's no pretending. There's no plagiarism. You're saying, I'm performing someone else's work that I love in my way. I love it so much that I want to do my version of it. It is not stealing, it's celebrating. Therefore, the originality argument becomes about something else, which is, what are you offering? Have you got something to say? There's a beautiful naivete to it. When you're young and hear a song, you think that it's a person's song and might not know that there was another version. I remember when James Blake first came out, and he did Limit to Your Love. I never knew that song existed before. I just discovered it through him. What I like about the idea of a cover version is that the spectrum is so wide. It ranges from doing a straight cover version of a song to taking 16 bars of a song and making something new, all the way through covering a hi-hat. So every time you buy the Whitney Houston 12-inch or the album with I Will Always Love You on it, Arista Records gets that money, and some percentage of that Whitney Houston is receiving. But every time that a song is played on the radio or licensed for a movie, it's Dolly Parton receiving the money because she wrote the song. Cover versions are directly connected to intellectual copyright. The idea in the music is that what's being covered, you know, rather than the actual hi-hat or the sound or whatnot. That's what makes it slightly different from sampling. Voodoo by D'Angelo, for example, is 40 minutes of the greatest original music of the greatest modern soul record of recent times. Folklore has it that the album took 5 years to make. It also claims that the first year they just covered every Prince and Marvin Gaye album. That shit exists somewhere. Those reels exist because I know Russell recorded everything. I'm completely paraphrasing, which is what all the best mythological stuff is about. Who knows if they really did that for a year or if it's just folklore now, but I held on to it because the idea of that being the exercise is the takeaway, not the literal number of songs they jam to. In a way, doing cover versions doesn't necessarily have to be related to releasing them. It's that the process of covering something doesn't necessarily have to be a product. It can be a press-up. It can be a way of working out what you would bring to it, or training, or deconstructing, or reverse engineering something as well. Radu Jud, the Romanian director, you might be familiar with his short and feature films. As part of our film screenings, we will show Do Not Expect Too Much from the End of the World, which is based on on a movie from the 80s, Angela merge mai departe. In this interview here, Radu was interviewed by Cosmin Nicolae, who did a piece on Pasolini. Radu said, funnily enough, for someone so highly awarded, but he says, I'm not a creative person. I need to feed on something to exist, to function. One could say somehow dishonest. The former Minister of Culture wrote that she saw my success in America as proof of the idea of fake it till you make it. I think she's right. I don't consider myself a cineast with vision, an authentic cineast, but rather someone who manages to make these movies starting from some things and trying to mix them one way or another. At one point, there was a choice I had to make. When I realized I don't have the talent that many of the directors I admire, I had this dilemma. Either I give up, find something else to do, or I find another way of doing it and live with it. And what I'm trying to do is to succeed in making films without being creative. And the only way I can do this is by thinking about the themes I touch on for a long time beforehand and gathering the materials I need. Said materials come in various ways, through research, through observation and gathering all of sorts of quotes or ideas from various places, collecting images, photographs, paintings. When I have enough material of all kinds, I create folders in my computer for each project. Some of these projects come together slowly over several years. Some never do. It's a gradual step-by-step thing. It's the way I can do things. And then lastly, Noir Al-Sadir, a psychoanalyst, writer, and poet. You might have met her here 10 days ago, actually. She wrote recently a book called Animal Joy. And when I asked her how she sees how the topic of cover relates to her work and to her book, she says, Donald Winnicott has this idea of the true self and the false self. The true self is not a self as we think of it colloquially, but a core, a wellspring of creative energies in the body. Winnicott explains the term through a scenario with an infant and its mother. If the infant makes a spontaneous gesture, whether with its body or through sound, and the mother, main caregiver, affirms it, then the infant feels free to express itself. If she corrects it and tries to get something else from the infant will learn to give people what they want from it in order to get love. And that's the birth of the false self. The false self is what we put forward when we are out in the world. I mean, nobody can just walk around with their true self exposed. It's precious and needs protection, which is part of what the false self does. The problem is that some people can develop such a strong false self that they lose contact with their true self, and their false self, which is like their cover, comes to stand in for who they are. And the false self is usually a replica of some model of what's valued. So it's not like the covers of someone's song. It's like a cover made up of a cultural ideal. Children are not concerned with the cover. They are concerned with impulses and drives, what the cover covers up. The false self, you have to have one to protect the true self. If you're going to have a false self anyway, you might as well make it one that you value. We all have one. You can have fun with it. Everybody has a true self, has that wellspring, but you can sometimes lose contact with it. It's comforting to know it's there. You just have to figure out how to get beneath the layers of socialization to reach it and make contact. You can feel it when you're in contact with it. It's like being with an old friend or being in a place that feels like home. I mean, home is of course never about the actual place that you live in. It's about a state of being. I personally think originality is a narcissistic delusion. How could you locate an origin? You could, probably, if you worked hard, trace the provenance of an idea in your own history to where it might have come from. But the pieces of it were usually already out in the world. I think it's David Hume, the philosopher, who says, when we imagine, we put together components of things we've actually encountered in the world to create images or ideas that are new. We're working with things that have already been perceived by us. Imagination works that way also. You might never have seen that what you're, for example, writing about, but as you put it together in your mind, you're using components of what you have seen, experienced, or know. I don't think you can create art if you're not in touch with your full self. So cover me softly. What is a cover? A cover is a musical performance based on an existing recording. The word was first used in musical jargon to refer to a security copy, a reproduction of a record created and managed to preserve the information in case the original is damaged. The actual practice of covering as we know it today started at a very particular moment of change in the US music industry, coinciding with the birth of rock. There's 3 mini chapters in this text that all are introduced through a song. The first one is I Can Get No Satisfaction, which was written by Keith Richards and Mick Jagger. The song was released in 1965 and was covered over 20 times in the same year. The way Otis Redding ended up doing it is probably closer to my original conception for the song. Our version was a demo for Otis, said Keith Richards, which is a very generous and beautiful way of looking at someone covering your own work. If you're willing to squint faintly, you see similarities to covers everywhere. In fashion, for example, Martin Margiela's Tubby shoes, which are having a moment right now. In film, Guadagnino's A Bigger Splash, or in Jacques Duray's La Piscine, if you've seen it last week. In literature, James Joyce's Ulysses speaking to Homer's Odyssey. In theater, West Side Story, relocating Romeo and Juliet to New York. And not to mention art. There's lots and lots of examples, many of them in the walls of this very building. This report is at times a dialogue of appropriation, at times friction, at times critique, at times theft or homage. It manifests often under different monikers, trends or remake or remix, and within the shifting framework of copyright laws, in all areas of human endeavor, at its best revealing our vast interconnectedness. Artist Etel Adnan, a Palestinian philosopher and painter who passed away only a few years ago, said beautifully, nothing exists alone. Everything is connected. It's inside connections, it seems to me, that we function. Tutti Frutti Good Booty. This was Little Richard's original verse, a graphic tribute to sex, turned into Tutti Frutti Oh Rudy in its popular version. So covers date all the way back to the 1950s, when consumers of pop generally bought the songs and not the singers. This was informed by the demands of the music industry, which maintained its principal source of revenue from the sales of sheet music. So it was in everyone's interest that more performers would perform the same song. Having the song proliferate, no matter the artist playing it, was profitable. The song was the thing that was valuable, not the artist. However, like most things in the US, music history too is tied to racial dynamics. Michael Coyle describes the cover record developing only when race records began to have mass appeal on white pop charts. And the key figure in that process was none other than Elvis Presley. The king came to his throne largely on the strength of the first cover records the world had ever known. Because Elvis is considered the kind of starting point of rock in the way that we know it, he's the first sort of author to that end. So throughout his career, Elvis Presley is credited to have sung around 500 covers. Of the 24 songs of his first 2 albums in 1956, 20 were covers, including Tutti Frutti, written and released 1 year later by Little Richard and covered a few months prior by Pat Boone. Boone's version made it to Billboard Top 12, Elvis's to 20, Little Richard's to 21. This all happened within 1 or 2 years. Little Richard, who described himself as one of the first people to ever come out, was being, as he says, pushed into a rhythm and blues corner to keep out of rockers' way, because that's where the money is. The white kids would have Pat Boone up on the dresser and me in the drawer because they liked my version better, but the families didn't want me because of the image that I was projecting. Greg Tate, reflecting in how black folk became fetish object, describes this phenomenon through Elvis as the American music industry's never-ending quest for a white artist who can competently perform a black musical impersonation. It contrived and promoted to do away with bodily reminders of the black origins of American pop pleasure. Cultural production, however, Fred Moten reminds us, is not analogous to the cultural product, and while both can be stolen, only the latter can be owned. And this is a point that's quite important to me, and then I hope we'll come back to a bit later, to making the difference between a product and a practice, between an experience or things that kind of cannot be taken away, cannot be sold, cannot be commodified, versus the product in itself. By 1968, Tutti Frutti had sold 3 million copies in America alone, and eventually was recognized as the single greatest rock record and America's other national anthem. In 1988, Little Richard was invited to present the Grammy for Best New Artist, but instead shared his feelings about the lack of acknowledgement of his work. There's a video on YouTube that you can watch today, and it's really amazing. So this is 30-something years after Tutti Frutti came out. And Little Richard goes, I can't do a proper impersonation, unfortunately. He says, and the best new artist is me. I have never received nothing. Y'all never gave me no Grammys, and I've been singing for years. I'm the architect of rock and roll, and I am the originator. He eventually received a Lifetime Achievement Award, a Grammy, 5 years later, but his first nomination, funnily enough, or ironically or sadly, all of the above, came only posthumously for, ironically, the music of the documentary of his own life. Take a sad song and make it better. It's a verse from Hey Jude by the Beatles, released in 1968, written by Lennon-McCartney, which topped the charts for 9 weeks, covered by Elvis Presley in 1969. In the 70 years since, the notion of the cover has changed along with the industry, becoming a tightly regulated practice, somehow universally sanctioned, but by no means easily definable. Covers became a way for artists to transgress and signify difference, to include themselves in a selected company, to honor or to jibe a referent, though it's an expensive joke because it is the songwriter who receives the royalties. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, a cover is a new recording of an old song by a different band or singer. Simple enough, but it gets very shaky once you start thinking of analogous practices in jazz, classical music, or the nuances of sampling. This becomes further complicated when songs themselves elude the legal definition. In a recent piece in the New York Times, the title is called What is a Song? They're talking about recent lawsuits in which the copyright issues are being debated. And one of the lawyers in the lawsuit explains that this is a deep existential metaphysical question at the center of music copyright. We don't even know what it is from a legal standpoint. Purists define a cover as an authentic performance based on a previously existing authentic recording, in line with Wittgenstein's premise that if you feel the seriousness of a tune, what you are perceiving cannot be conveyed by reproducing what you heard, which is a very beautiful point. What I thought was also quite interesting, this notion of authenticity that we're so familiar with today, that's such an important term, actually originated in gospel, where it was very important for the audience to distinguish between the performers who are genuinely committed to spreading the word versus the ones that were not. And it wasn't just that the performer had to be authentic, but that covers also had an authenticating effect, extending the credibility and authenticity of the cover through the established cultural capital of the original, right? So kind of saying, I get to cover a famous song, I associate myself with said artist. A bit of a different and more inclusive definition establishes a spectrum based on fidelity to original, instated through 4 categories. Mimicking covers, which aim merely to echo the canonical track, so tribute bands, the kind of everyday covers. 2, rendition covers, which change the sound of the canonical track. You can watch online Patti Smith's rendition of Oana Sta at the Webster Hall in 2013, which is very moving. 3, transformative covers, which diverge so much as to instantiate a distinct, albeit derivative song. Cat Power's version of the Rolling Stones' Satisfaction. and 4 referential covers, which not only instantiate a distinct song, but for which the new song is in part about the original song, like Nina Simone's version of I Want a Little Sugar in My Bowl, of Bessie Smith's song. Cat Power is a very interesting artist to that end, because for her covers are a through line of her discography. She has 8 albums which are 99% self-authored completely. She always makes a point of saying, I don't work with producers. She writes them, she makes the music, she makes everything. And yet she has 4 albums of just covers. So she describes making a cover as, I think it's something like when archaeologists are uncovering the bones of some ancient animal. There's a certain amount of responsibility with those bones, you know. So she has the covers record, jukebox, and covers. You find an incredible list of artists, from Frank Ocean to Iggy Pop to Mae West. The Frank Ocean cover is incredible. Liza Minnelli, Janis Joplin, Billie Holiday, James Brown. So these covers become entirely their own. They're authentic records. There's usually a story attached to them. It's some sort of emotional translation, she says. Certain songs have helped me feel understood. And importantly, they all reflect back onto her own music. She says, I think it's helped me be more open towards doing my own thing, my own lyrics, my own production, and my own musicality. This speaks a little bit to the previous point that Benji was making too, that of covering as training and as a form of practice. In 2022, however, which was very interesting, she decided to make a very different kind of cover, namely the entirety of a record, Bob Dylan's live 1966, the Royal Albert Hall concert. There's very many interesting stories around this. For example, the title of Bob Dylan's album has the Gillimele quotation marks, because it actually was recorded in Manchester, not at the Royal Albert Hall in London, but the bootlegs kept saying Royal Albert Hall, so then that became part of the title of it. And Cat and Dylan had already a long sort of relationship, or artistic sort of mediated relationship. For example, at one point Dylan performed I Believe in You, which was his song, with her added verse. The Royal Albert Hall concert was, though, very different. She said in this case she didn't want to create a new type of cover. It wasn't about her changing anything or adding herself to it. She says, it's important for me not to do my thing. I'm not being Bob, not at all. I'm just recreating, that's it, but not making it mine. She describes it as protecting these songs, a true homage, precisely because he is alive. And I have a hard time imagining a more daunting cover than that. I got to watch her perform in Marseille in June or July. And there was this one specific moment. It was a very beautiful and very moving, actually. But there was this moment, if you're familiar with Dylan's album, that concert was very famous because he started playing electronic music quite loud. And people from the audience were upset with him. And at one point someone called Judas for betraying, in a way, and moving from folk into electronic. And as Cat Power was performing in Marseille, at one point someone did yell Judas from the audience and kind of brought the cover, the role of the audience. The audience performed its own role in recreating the cover, which was quite moving. Give Me Shelter by the Rolling Stones. We're moving a little bit into architecture in a second. Are there any questions before we're moving forward, or any thoughts at this stage? Or you can hear me all right? It still makes sense. I haven't lost you. Okay, Give Me Shelter. It's a song by the Rolling Stones. In 1993, a Food Records project collected various versions of the track by various bands and collaborators, the proceeds of which went to the shelter charity's Putting Our House in Order homeless initiative. So in architecture, the vernacular can be seen as proximate to the cover, right? In Christopher Alexander's perspective, an unself-conscious process where resources and scarcity, tradition and function are the drivers of the building process, its strength and repetition and adaptation. This kind of so-called architecture without architects, although today we call architecture without architects something quite different, doesn't much exist as such anymore, and is replaced by the architect as the self-conscious, eternally original master. As noble as the high art form might be, reinventing the wheel, so insisting that buildings be invented anew every single time, seems really rather beside the point of an entire profession. After all, the profession has more pressing responsibilities, namely addressing its role in climate change as well as the housing crisis. And this is where we get some of these terrible and, well, I was going to say boring facts, but they're unfortunately far from boring. So the UN Global Status Report for Buildings and Construction from 2023 is not for the faint of heart. The construction sector contributes about 21% of global greenhouse gas emissions, so that's a fifth, with buildings responsible for 34% of the global energy demand and 37% of energy and process-related carbon dioxide emissions. This is not even mentioning the waste that happens from demolition on other aspects. The trajectory is charted towards the goals of the 2030 Paris Agreement. I mean, we've all heard about the Paris Agreement also when the US tried to opt out under Trump, and I hadn't actually looked at them in a while, and I think it's very healthy to revisit them. But basically, from 2015, so almost 9 years ago when they were signed, it shows, most charts show no progress, and then from now to 2030, we have to now all of a sudden go like this. It's very strange to even look at the chart, because if this 8 years there was next to no progress on most fronts, why are we still looking at these charts? Why is 2030 still there in the same form? In the words of architecture critic and writer Ollie Wainwright, if we stand any chance of averting climate catastrophe, we must start with buildings and stop conceiving them in the same way we have for centuries. There's an urgent need for a new perspective, and dare we say a slightly humbler one. Lacaton Vassal's response in the 1996 Bordeaux City Council, when they were asked by the Bordeaux City Council to embellish Place Léonard Coq, was sobering. You can see a lot of Lacaton Vassal work in this first room here, represented by Atmos Lab, an environmental office from the UK. And what they said is, on our first visit, we get the feeling that this square is already beautiful because it's authentic, lacking in sophistication. Embellishment has no place here. Quality, charm, life exist. The story itself has been told and retold many times. The architect's position is treated as miraculous, if not subversive, in the context of the profession. It's treated like such an exception. Was just recently presented at the Kunstmuseum in Berlin as well. And there's a sadness to this story from 30 years ago, kind of being still held as an example of look how brave they were to not make an image, but to rather embrace a place. As a project, we've proposed doing nothing apart from some simple and rapid maintenance work, they say. What I find very powerful in them telling the story is, in many ways, they kind of are re-articulating their own understanding of beauty, which is that of what is obvious, necessary, and right. I think modernity kind of had a quite radically different perspective on this notion of beauty. So Lacaton's Vassal, very famous mantra, meanwhile, that of never demolished, I think them getting the Pritzker Prize sort of legitimized this approach and kind of made a little bit more room in the architecture world, prompting a slow yet systemic embrace of this idea. There are very interesting things happening on that front. So for example, the city of Amsterdam is in the process of cataloging the material elements of public buildings in digital records. So that means they would go around the building like this, and every single piece of material, every piece of wood would have a catalog number with all the properties associated. That means that as long as it's identified and cataloged, it's not trash. Trash are just things that we don't know anything about. So with this, they call them actually digital passports. So they open the possibility of recycling and reuse or disassembly rather than demolition. There's a lot of buildings being built actually also through this prism of them being eventually demolished instead of just destroyed. On another front, there's a recent European Citizens Initiative, which proposes legislation that prioritizes renovation and adaptation over demolition and reconstruction. If this is in progress now, so if 1 million EU citizens from a minimum of 7 countries support the legislation, the European Commission must consider the proposal. The fact that such policies are not yet in place, actually, though, I mean, it seems so sensible, no? It makes so perfect sense. But in the same time, the fact that such policies are not in place yet exposes the hypocrisy between the agenda of climate change, the taglines, the buzzwords, the products, and the actual commitments to the status quo. There's a jarring dissonance for anyone who's lived in architecture, if only for a minute. There's a jarring dissonance between the oversimplification of architectural discourse, the reality of the profession, and its business baby attitude of the housing market. Despite playing what feels like a zero-sum game, the tools to at very least curb, if not postpone extinction, are very much at our disposal. It's not, so to speak, rocket science. I feel that's something that I keep coming back to. I feel quite often this notion of climate change, or the world that we find in, is kind of tries to be solved, at least in the States, through this prism of whether it's techno-positivism, we need to invent something to save us from this thing we created. But I think it's much simpler than that. I think it's purely a question of will and of how committed we are to the status quo or to the future. So what we are being tested for is the so-called reach of the ethical notion of humanity. It's not ingenuity, it's not blind techno-positivism. If we choose to rise to the occasion, we have to begin by looking into the mirror and recognize an architecture's entanglement with the world. The starting point is quite simple, should be what's in front of us and making do with what we have. It might, after all, be more than enough. And I think Romania, to that end, presents a very important case to consider. The EU state has the highest risk of poverty in Europe and a rapidly deteriorating housing stock, occupied by a population with one of the highest housing ownership rates in the world, 95.3%, only recently surpassed by China. One of the highest overcrowding rates in the EU, 40.5% compared to an average of 16.8%, and one of the highest vacancy rates, 16%. This is matched by one of the fastest shrinking demographics. The country has experienced a population decline of approximately 20% since 1989, as we've all experienced it and know it, with an estimated loss of more than 15% by 2015. Romanians also represent the largest group of EU citizens residing in other EU countries, standing at 23%, so almost a quarter of all EU citizens living in other countries that where they're from are Romanians. The reality is it's hard to build a life here. For anyone who has the experience of building a public project on EU funding, it's not much easier either. It has little to do with design or quality or sustainability, and a lot to do with bureaucracy and the amount of euros per screw. Architects become administrators, swearing on their mothers' dead relatives to never attempt such an undertaking again. The process often defaults, reinforcing its own premise of impossibility. It's only called corruption in the East, after all. I was quite surprised recently in an interview by Rem Koolhaas in Die Zeit, a German magazine, to see him kind of call out the EU to that end. He says the 6 founding states of the EU have failed to establish a deep connection with the EU members in Eastern Europe. After all, globalization is nothing but a strategy for maximum exclusion. Romania, a tiny example in a much bigger and much more complex world. And I think that's something that we've all been exposed to and understand deeply as well. So the premise, to bring it back to covers, the premise of a cover is to start with what is there. Ecologically as well as ethically, this seems imperative today. There's superficial change that benefits the few, and then there's real change. The latter cannot be envisioned without commitment to context and to the embrace of difference. It's not so much the what as it is the how. Girl, it's so confusing sometimes. Charlie XX with Lord, this is a song released by Charlie with Lord in 2024. And Charlie got mistaken recently, or not recently, a while ago, sorry, for a Lord by an interviewer. And then it started the decade-long meme comparing the two singers. So what about the original, which kind of seems to be really a point of friction in this entire conversation? So the word original originates poetically in the Latin oriri, to rise. In 1240, Old French defined it as that which is innate by birth or nature. As it is in the current Oxford Dictionary, it is the point or place where something begins, arises, or is derived, as well as the mathematical fixed point from which coordinates are measured. Author is also tied to the Latin origination, authentic defined as of undisputed origin. The word original itself traps one into confounding the abstract with the fixed. However, like most concepts, it is always culturally and historically contingent, a pair of glasses to write history through. I think this is an important point, having lived through the last, let's say, tumultuous 2-3 decades. you feel the changing of the understanding of words or concepts, and kind of reminding ourselves. I find that the job of a designer is to interrogate everything in front of us, including the words. And I think that's something that I keep trying to come back to all the time, outside of being a designer in the everyday life, which is that of interrogating what these words mean that we're using on a daily basis, and kind of carrying around with us. So originality became a focus of artistic discourse in the 1800s, reverberating within architecture, shifting the emphasis of value from building to author, similar to the way that from music, from song to singer years later. The international framework for authors' rights was initiated around the same time, in 1886, through the Berne Convention for the Protection of Literary and Artistic Works, today signed by 181 countries. In the last room here on the right side, what we call the fashion room, there's an entire piece written by Irina Rice. She's a lawyer, and she talks about trademark and copyright law in parallel between music and architecture and artistic practices, and you can learn a little bit more about the subject if that intrigues you. In this very interesting piece from 1989, and this is a piece that I urge everyone to read if you haven't yet, I keep coming back to it. Denise Scott Brown asks, why do architects need to create stars? Here she already had a practice with her husband. They've been working together for decades, yet in every single instance she was either not invited to dinners, or the husband was kind of talked about in higher terms as she was just his secretary, although she had a career way before him. So she wrote this piece, which is close to 25 years ago, asking, why do architects need to create stars? And she finds a way to think about it through the prism of, well, faced with unmeasurables, people steer their way by magic. Before the invention of navigational instruments, a beautiful lady was carved on the prow of the boat to help sailors cross the ocean. And architects, grappling with the intangibles of design, select a guru. So basically the architect becomes the guru that helps navigate people through these many unmeasurables. Scott Brown went on to say that that she suspects the architectural gurus have to be male, and rather generously that stars cannot create themselves. This is only half true, though, because architectural education itself was essential to the construction of the author figure. The Beaux-Arts pedagogy playing a key role in establishing a puzzling definition of singular authorship that favors personal distinction, competitiveness, introversion, and isolation from 1819 onwards. In the shop downstairs, you can find this magazine. It's called Oana Sta, and there's a piece by, let me see if I can find her. But there's this piece coming shortly that speaks to the correlation between the physical space of Beaux-Arts education and its impact on the notion of author and our understanding of authors and authorship. So you're welcome to look at it, and I will find it. Anyway, it's here somewhere. The Architecture of the Making of the Author by Sevgi Turkan. I leave it open here, and you can find this downstairs. So architecture was removed from the École des Beaux-Arts as a result of the student demonstrations of Paris in May of 1968, but not so much, of course, the faith in or the need for masters. The immense pressure of the original in architecture comes along with the need to make sense of unmeasurables in times when everything wants to be measured, the architect himself commodified, from the very premise of the profession itself. It's a highly limited and tightly regulated practice defined by building codes, technical performance, restrictive licensure, and a globalized construction market. This also points to the fact that the question of originality, which most of architectural education itself is still beholden to, is a lot more porous than one might assume. Out of all creative forms, which is interesting because we encounter quite many in this exhibition, architecture is by far the most limited, right? We can only do so many things with our bodies. There's windows, doors, code, all these kind of things. Yet the premium of originality is so much higher, maybe because of this. But this also begs the question, of course, where does one draw the line between inspiration, tradition, derivative, or copy when the canvas is barely blank? Need a Little Sugar in My Bowl. This is a Dirty Blue song, first recorded in 1931 by Bessie Smith, which was covered by Nina Simone in her I Want a Little Sugar in My Bowl in 1967. She replaced the line, I need a little hot dog on my roll, with I want a little sweetness down in my soul. In one of the most incredible live performances of the song at the New York City Philharmonic Hall in 1973, I really encourage you to listen to it. Nina Simone scolds at one point a largely white audience mid-song and says, Bessie Smith, you know? And just as we're coming to the end, neurologically, there is no mathematical zero. And I think quite often we mistake the point or the term of architecture, of originality, with this mathematical zero. The human brain is contextual. It functions only through the prism of an accumulation of everything we have experienced, read, heard, felt, touched, or seen. From the first cry, announcing the first breath, we absorb, recall, feel. Rupert Spira reminds us that everything that is known by the mind is an expression and reflection of its own limitations. Most minds forget their own limitations and project them instead onto whatever they know or perceive. Take language. There are words for emotions in certain cultures that do not have an equivalent in other languages. Using here as an example, anxiety in German, the word anxiety does not exist in German. The only way you can translate it is as Angst, which means fear in German. This doesn't mean, of course, that German cures anxiety or that Germans do not experience anxiety, but it reveals how our own understanding of emotions and of ourselves is framed by language and therefore limited by it. So the question here, and why this notion of covers, is what if we uncover a vocabulary, a framework, to dispel the individual's remoteness, the expert's detachment, the professional's insularity, and the guru's idolatry? The original is then not mystical isolation, but the weaving together of what has been encountered, lived, and recorded. The physicality of our bodies alone is deeply misleading. It implies containment, autonomy, and self-sufficiency. It suggests a soft yet hard limit to our being, misguided illusions of control, borders, countries within their own right. Scientific evolution has long influenced societal frameworks, and we know that when together, our bodies synchronize breathing or heartbeats. When we miss someone, like Amanda, it is a physical burden. What if we truly assume that there are no real distinctions between our own molecules and the molecules of the world around us? That at a subatomic level we are part of a continuum? What if we are to seize our interconnectedness? What if we embrace that the boundary between us and the world is neither fixed nor material, that we ebb and flow into one another and each other? What horizons could open? What could be if we are to orient ourselves anew, less concerned with where we begin or end than to cover softly? And just to summarize a little bit what I mean with that and where I want to, or was hoping in a way to go with it, both within the exhibition and in this moment here, is, you know, I think it's clear that the architectural profession is in a rut, heading very, very determinantly towards an abyss of sorts. It's such a distinct moment of change. We all feel it, we all know it. In the same time, we have the pressures of media, of the world around us. We're very used of barking at each other constantly through social media, through all sorts of forms of information, everything being commodified, including us, including our thoughts, including our forms of communication. What I was hoping in a way is to find here, by being together in a space, by finding a new way of for finding new ways of togetherness, or finding just an excuse for collectivity. Music is the best excuse for that. And in a way remind ourselves both of the complexity of the issue, that there isn't a simple answer for any of the things that we're trying to address, but that we can also remind ourselves of some of the beauty of what it means to be people, to be human, to be together. And hopefully to allow ourselves to then question, where do we want to be going to? I think it's very hard to find answers as band-aids to our current situation. What I think we miss a lot is really just the ability to imagine a future. And that requires a big effort. I feel the pandemic really showed us that the impossible is largely possible. It would have been unthinkable before. So I think it's really key that we find the courage and really imagine a desired future as a way to fight towards it or to try to walk towards it, as opposed to just constantly responding to our immediate pressures. And maybe the last way to end it, I had read this to the Beda team a couple of times, so sorry if you're hearing it for the 5th time, but maybe a small parenthesis where this notion of covers, but where music can make a difference too. I'm using a quote from Ethel Adnan. The Beauty of Light is a series of interviews with her. And she says, when I was professor of philosophy of art, I had students who told me, this picture has no meaning. And it was very hard to explain the abstract to them without nattering on or making things up. So I would respond, look, when you listen to Beethoven, for example, you don't say that it has no meaning, but you don't explain it either. The same goes for an abstract painting. It's not made to be translated into words. And I wonder if through this exhibition and through this time that we're spending together, we can make a little bit more room for the things that maybe don't fit into the current words that we have for things, or allow us to find maybe new words for things. And that's it. Harry is still here. There is another mic, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of this, and maybe we can turn it into a conversation. Please.
Hello, thank you. And thank you for all the references. I'm glad this is recorded so I can watch it again and take notes.
We have all the footnotes with, to be shared.
Just wanted to ask you if you've ever covered the building yourself in any of your projects. Like, do you feel like any of the work you've done was a cover in a way, if it was intentional, or if you were to be commissioned to do it now, how would you go about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is part of the exhibition. We asked other people to do it, but I actually am dying to. As soon as someone gives me, half a day of time, I think it's I would love to. I am really intrigued about what can come of it. But I think there is a reality to architecture where any project is so highly contextual that it will become its own thing. Yeah, I mean, the first time I've done it was in the classroom of Domnul Andreescu, in the course of modern history, and I found it was a very useful exercise, and so I taught a studio at UCLA in spring on the notion of covers, and we did something similar. Come here. And we did something similar where the students had to take case study houses and then rebuild them and redraw them. So even if you try just to do that exercise of drawing, because I think this is the thing with architecture. Architecture isn't just the final building. There's a concept phase, there's a drawing phase, there's models. Like a building doesn't exist through so many different iterations. So I think a cover can manifest itself also in different ways or in different moments. The other thing that happened to me, though, is, for example, there's this bridge project, which is a circular bridge, which we've done for the competition in Maribor in Slovenia. And people oftentimes will say that it looks like Sana or it looks like something Japanese, which to me is a huge compliment. I don't think they mean it as a compliment necessarily, or not everyone. But I do find it's a compliment also because there isn't a project that exists as such as that of Sana. And maybe the last thing I can say to this is, I remember when I worked at Sana, though, we, at one point, Sejima-san was working on a house. She also was building her own projects outside of Sana with Nishizawa. And she was, at one point, the house started looking like the Prada Aoyama done by Herzog de Meuron. And this was a highly successful project. It had just opened a few years before, and everyone on the project, all the interns and everyone younger, was freaking out. Oh my God, the office has lost its spark. This looks like Herzog. It's the end of the world, which is a Swiss project in Japan, And the only person who didn't care for it was Sejima-san, because she knew that it's just part of a process, and she didn't let herself be unfazed. Of course, there are different projects, they speak different things, and of course the project also evolved into this thing. But in a way, I'm also less, I think I want to wonder why, if our job here is to provide housing, right, or cover or shelter, why not focus on what works and find an ability to use those things? It seems absurd that we have to kind of pretend to be reinventing the wheel all the time, but also just there's such a discrepancy, of course, between that and where architecture is. And so what can happen in this in between, but also in a legitimized way. This isn't to make developer buildings that are built poorly, right? But is, can you focus on the responsibility of the profession first, and then ego and all these other things that come after, second? Seems to be too much to ask. You've all worked on this many of you have worked on this for a year. I'm sure you have some thoughts. Sunt timizi, nu vor să pună întrebări. Te rog.
So I was having a friend of mine joining me today for the visit to the exhibition, and she isn't an architect. She was trying to understand what this biennale means, actually, and what does it mean, at least for us as architects. And I was trying to tell her that everything here has, in a certain way, let's say, it has to do something, at least a bit, with the profession of architecture, at least the exploration of, let's say, the original part, or the path of trying to find yourself as an architect. But what is your perception on how this biennale could be viewed by the general public? And maybe this is like a two-part question. The second one is regarding how you see the biennales in general. Do they have like this sort of evolution or involution towards the general public and how they perceive architecture?
Thank you. A very good point. I mean, I told Alexandra from the beginning that part of the reason why I wanted to do this, to take on the curatorial effort, is because I don't like architecture biennials. Like in Venice, I would go to the art biennial way happier than the architecture one. Partially because architecture is not made to be exhibited, right? So then you're always talking about something that isn't there. And I think that's an issue, but also I find the discourse in general is just quite isolated from the reality of a profession. There's a few things in terms of just reality checks that are never really fully being talked about. And so that was in a way the starting point from me. I was asked a lot, but two things early on, or I don't know if a lot, but one, if the audience will be local or international. Bună seara. Just in time for questions, Coco. If the local is international or local, which for me the question is always, where does one draw the line? Where does one begin and where does it end? And then the other question too was, now I lost my train of thought. But I think the other thing was just how, if it's a strict architectural audience or who the audience is. For me, the primary concern or the primary audience is actually a young generation of people. They might be in architecture, or they might be intrigued by other forms of creativity that permeate and percolate today. Sometimes, but not always necessarily making full sense of it. And for me, I kind of took it out from the text, but the way this whole thing started actually with the cover was when I was just listening to this Cat Power song, and I realized when she does I can't get enough of that satisfaction, she never says those words. And that sort of blew my mind, because all of a sudden, I mean, I'm a complete amateur, I know nothing about music, I'm just enjoying it. But there was the first time when I was like able, outside of Studio Forme and Anno Doi, when I was able to see, in a way, music, or to understand it in such conceptual level where I was like, well, wait, this can be applied to a building. Like, what would the equivalent be of taking something, redoing it, but not doing the chorus and changing the vibe, yet it hints to the original. Like, it's such a poetic and powerful and beautiful way. So I was able to learn something through it. There is something accessible and playful in it. It doesn't have the baggage of bootleg, remix, theft, any of those things. And to me, that accessibility of simply because there is a term of comparison that happens on all these walls, it gives someone an insight that they might not have had without having to know much more. And in a way, I think that gets one on the slippery slope, or not slippery slope, but you kind of slip directly into process of, oh, I could start with something existing without having had to have much baggage or much history to it, right? And I think that is, in a way, important to me. It's not so much to be dogmatic as accessible, and not just to a limited audience, but to a broad audience. I don't really draw the distinction. I don't think that we draw the distinction in the exhibition between architecture and non-architecture audience. Some people might have more of a taste than something else. But I would hope that people don't feel like there's nothing that, you know how people oftentimes leave the exhibition as like, yeah, maybe this is interesting for architects, but I have no idea what to do with this. You know, we are all, that's one thing. I think to your point too, and sorry, I don't know if I'm answering it directly, I'm kind of rambling a little bit through it. But the other thing, to your point too, I think for me there's something directly relevant to architecture in everything here. And to give you an example, the white t-shirt exhibition in the back, it started as quote-unquote the history of the white t-shirt. And the white t-shirt is so interesting because it's such a basic form of design, yet the difference of 3 centimeters or a different cut or like a detail of a seam will have a huge different cultural context and will tell you something about an era, right? Tight in the 70s, super long in like the mid-2010s and so on and so forth. And that to me is design. But design in which we don't really talk about in architecture school anymore. I find there isn't much design actually happening in architecture school in the same way that design, like in industrial design, means do something, repeat it, do it again. My experience in the schools where I taught was that there is actually very little design. So I think that is a great example of just understanding the impact of a detail, of a single element onto the entirety of things. So I feel there is a connection to architecture, but maybe it's partially not the way to trick, but to broaden the conversation to see what can we learn from, I don't know, people in fashion, but equally the people in fashion, allowing them to have an opinion or a kind of way into these other aspects as well. Did I miss anything?
Maybe the part regarding this one.
Hmm?
Like as a comparison, maybe with if you know the other biennales that happened before, like the one. Like
Oh, sorry, the previous ones within Timișoara, you mean, yeah.
Generally speaking.
Well, I'm less, I mean, I've seen some of them, and of course we looked at the documentation and everything, and of course the one 2 years ago was during the pandemic created and then very beautifully installed, and then the one 2 years ago in a public space, which I think was also very beautiful and very generous. I feel my fear was, what I didn't want to do, I mean, there's many things happening here, but one of them was and that's why the main installation is really both of these two beautiful installations executed by Anka and her amazing family. Are done with textiles, with fabric. They're light, they can be reused. I didn't want to put the premium again on the build and on the image. That is how we think of architecture today, or how we mostly, and when I say we is relative of course, but we ingest it through images, which are two-dimensional. Also only architects called Rhino three-dimensional, like it's still two-dimensional. You're still only judging buildings through a photograph, an image. Not that it can't tell you something, but it will never tell the full story of something. And I think that's a dangerous game, which again has little to do with, yes, it puts a premium on an artistic side, but it doesn't speak to the reality and the context that we're actually in and some of our other kind of jobs that we have to do. So I didn't want to just be building, and I think that's very hard with many of the architects that we've been talking to. Everyone was like, give me the keys to one of the galleries so I can do my own thing. And we're like, nope, not gonna happen. But also the first thing I told everyone is like, we're not gonna build. We don't want to just build things that after 6 weeks we have to throw away. And of course, you're still building something, but there was not the primary purpose. That's why there's a book, there's going to be essays, and there are these essays in the book, there's a lot to be reading on it. Putting essays on the wall also doesn't help anyone, but instead focusing on the space as a club, a social club, a nightclub, a space where we can encounter each other. It almost by accident, I think, happened too because the exhibition got so big that in a way it forces you to come back. If you want to see it, you will come back, or you're coming back just for the coffee, or you're coming back just because of the lawn. But I think it creates this dynamic of people returning. And to me, there's two things that are happening here. One, it's this building that we've had here for 200 something years, but we never had it as such for the public. And in a way, you know, when people ask where is the architecture outside it being everywhere, you're also just living in it. For the architect, that's somehow weirdly unsatisfying when, in a way, the whole point of a building, the whole way of understanding architecture, the only way to test it is by how it works. In the building, what we didn't want to do, we didn't want to pretend that this is a finished museum, a white box, that it's something that it's not. And that it's something that it was trying to be before. So again, it wasn't so much about the image, but it was really trying to unearth, okay, how can you put your money in an intelligent way in a lawn that is here to stay until hopefully they won't be building that museum. But equally, in revealing if you pass through those galleries, you're gonna see on the ground floor in Prague, parquet original, the original wooden flooring. In some of the walls, you're unearthing, there's all these wood pieces, you're unearthing. You're kind of trying to show what it is. And in a way, I think this is important because you can't build this today anymore. So part of it was trying to also be surgical with this space instead of building something else, but altogether the thinking is less focused on here's the hero shot, here are the 5 things that we're building, but instead let's put money in something that can have a longer term impact. We got very attached to the building. Ziceam că ne-am atașat foarte mult de clădirea asta în procesul ăsta de împărtășire, a descoperire a clădirii. Domnul Emil a fost staționat aici din 71 până în 2000. We're making, I think, for me, what was fascinating in these last days is also just because it's so central. The kind of people that walk in, you're meeting people that worked here, you're meeting people that were stationed here very briefly, you're meeting people that have been incarcerated here, you're meeting people that kind of stumble it and come in for very different reasons. And in a way, to me, that shows the power of an architecture. I mean, the main power of an architecture is that of it being a place where people can come together, right? And I think what we need today more than ever is togetherness. Even more so in a country in which we, for 50 years, had to be suspicious of one another. And we're never quite comfortable in the public space because public space was always a dangerous space. So I think the biggest sort of thing you can do in a space is, and I'm not saying Timișoara doesn't have spaces of gathering, but creating one in this case that allows very many different groups of people to intersect. And the kind of history that we're learning about ourselves, about each other, the kind of people we're encountering, for me has been really unexpected actually in many ways. I don't know that it was all super rational. I think many things happened intuitively. But I know I've learned a lot about architecture in this past few months working in this building with this team and kind of revealing what a space can do for people.
Hey. I think the power of this biennial of this edition is the interconnectedness, the multidisciplinarity of it, and the way all these creative fields are brought together. And I was wondering if during your career and academic career especially, is it something that you've been witnessing since forever? I mean, is it something that in the schools where you thought people are super excited of discussing about this in such a broader way? Because I feel that as a young teacher in the school, I still in Timișoara, I feel that is a little bit. This is a little bit missing still, and I'm curious how we could, open a dialogue towards different creative fields more oftenly.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think for me, the multidisciplinarity that people keep talking about also happens in an innate way. But to some of the things that Chris was saying earlier with the work done at MIT or in other places is, I mean, technically architecture is innately multidisciplinary. And we all say that in school, but we rarely do it. And I mean, I think it's hard to teach architecture because it's hard to simulate it. It's hard to simulate the unpredictability to it, the kind of long-term aspects, so on and so forth. But I do feel, so anyway, there's that side to it. My second education outside of the education here was working in a bunch of offices, right? So I worked for Omei, I worked for Hartsaga, I worked for Sana in Japan, I worked for Architecture for Humanity in Africa, and then Noemeg in New York. I feel there might have been someone else, but I forgot. And so I had to learn how architecture is being done to kind of then ask myself the question, how do I want to talk about architecture? I mean, ironically, and Chris was laughing at me when I said that recently. I said the one thing that I know how to do is how to design a building. Like that's the one thing that I can do right. I would never say I know how to curate something. But in a way there is something deeply dissatisfying to me with the isolation of architecture sometimes. Or in a way, not just that, but for me, design lies in this intersection of the different fields and the conversation between people, whether it's the engineer or whether it's the musician or whether it's the whoever. You need to understand the people that you're designing for and working with. And so for me, that's also where things get exciting or interesting. So I think in many ways, I've been very selfish with the biennial. Like I hope it's generous, but I'm also very selfish because these are some of the things that I'm into, and where it's how I'm trying to unlearn some of the architectural baggage that I come with. Or I think many of us, or many of young people too, there's one of the footnotes here actually is from Oana Bogdan, where she talks in a recent interview, which is on her website, which I recommend you to read, how out of all professions, architecture is in the worst place. Like 50, like in terms of the ratio of investment and return, architecture is 58% to 100% versus, I don't know, lawyers, doctors are 120%, if not 180, and so on and so forth. So it is hard to make a living as an architect, not just in Romania, anywhere else. Romania has some of the highest number of architects per quota, and not that there isn't work, and not that it isn't great. But I still think it's a difficult profession, and I think many of us are just asking ourselves what do you do with the skill set? I'm very much pro building, or in a way pro space. I believe, let me put it this, I believe in the power of the space more than I believe necessarily in maybe building new, or in the need for the new. And so the power of the space can be approached from many different perspectives. And I guess one of it is starting with the new, but I have an appetite like everyone else towards building as well. But if the focus is really just a quality of a space or the power of a space and what it can do for certain places, I think that's where I'm trying to kind of be. And outside of that is, again, we're generalists, we're not specialists. Education points towards many different things. And I think there's a huge value to the education, partially because architecture is with a foot in the past and with a foot in the future. It operates at a very different speed than many of the things around us. And I think one of our biggest skill set as architects is the ability to look at a really kind of complicated, complex situation and keep our cool and work our way through it in a creative way and kind of not lose your cool through. Like in a way, it's trusting the process. And that's not true. I don't know how many other professions necessarily have that innately. So I think we come with, I think the perspective of the architects are highly valuable, but not necessarily in the way in which we've been taught that they are. And maybe the last example I will give to that end, the class that Chris was talking about was a class on abortion clinics at MIT. We taught 3 years. It was called Blueprints of Justice. And you know, in these classes, we did a lot of research. So we started by talking with abortion providers, with patients, with doctors, with nurses, with politicians, with lawyers, with everyone and everything. And everyone was getting very riled up about, of course, about the injustice and the absurdity of the situation. The conversation has nothing to do with abortion per se. It's healthier than, I don't know, most things. It's healthier than Viagra, and no one is trying to cut Viagra from the market for some reason. So doing that, like, everyone builds this healthy appetite, the entire class of like, oh my God, this is incredible, you know, incredible injustice, whatever, builds this energy, very healthy. And then the moment we had to propose what our project was, the morale was like, we're screwed. We have nothing to offer. And in a way, there was an irony because everyone who wasn't an architect was like, oh my God, architects, we're so excited. We really need help. The facade here doesn't hold. The circulation here sucks. People were asking for playlists, like for the room, for the quality of space. Yet we as architects were like, we don't know how to help you. And what that told me actually, what that showed me how innate, how deep that sort of education lies, or that sort of urge of, if I can't save the day, if I can't ride in on my white horse and save the day, then there's nothing to do. It's almost like it's all or nothing. If I can't be the architect at the middle of the tension, and if I can't solve all of the abortion crisis, then I'm just gonna go home. Instead of accepting your little role there and sitting at the table with everyone else and trying to work through it. And that was very sobering, because I was like, how can it be that all these people are so excited to meet with architects and architectures, you know, so much work. And we're like, oh, we couldn't see our own value. And there's a dissociation there. So I think there's huge importance and value to architecture, but I think we can't see it because of our own nose. And I feel there was something else there, but now I lost track.
Remember that conversation, and you said that the people in the group which were not architects were like, why would you think that you can save the world? Well, this is not the case.
The lawyers were saying, we were working with lawyers from the Stanford Legal Design Lab, and they said, why do you guys feel you can solve the abortion issues? We as lawyers can't. Like, why do you guys as architects think you can? I was like, well, we can't save anything. And you know, the other way of looking at it is, I just don't see and this isn't, I'm not saying this is the answer to anything. What I'm trying to say is we're too far out in one direction, that of being isolated in a bubble. None of the issues that we're dealing with can be addressed, like let's say climate change, how politics, any of it, can be fully addressed by a single field. It's not lawyers who can do it, it's not politicians. You need to work together. And I feel a big part of what one of the skill sets that we have, again, as architects, which when we did the class on courthouses, people there asked us to design courthouses that could reflect what a healthy justice system would be. So a courthouse that would have additional program and social support services and all these kind of things. Could it be done tomorrow? No. But they felt we need to show what the space like that could look at. We need to paint what a vision could be so that people could work towards it. So, you know, in the abortion clinics, it was very different. It was right now, how do we move storage around to create a sound barrier so we don't hear the crazy people outside protesting or things like that. So it's different responses in different cases, but there is a broader way, and I think that just accepting our very important role, I think, in this larger conversation is key. But it's not about us anymore.
So, I really enjoyed this message, and I feel like it's a bit of a challenge that you're launching for a younger generation that sort of looks at this. I really like that expression of the guru architect and the architect as the commodified guru architect. But I feel like there's a lot of pressure, especially on the young generation, to innovate, to be themselves. So it's sort of a goal to them to achieve that status, because as you said, it's a very difficult profession to act in. So if only you could get to that level, it seems like this is the maximum potential that architecture can offer you, is to reach that level, the star architect level. And then it's going to get easier, then it's going to get all good. But in order to do that, you need to innovate, you need to break ground, to be completely different from anything else. So I really enjoyed this challenge that I feel like you're launching for architects, that it's okay not to do that. It's okay to take inspiration from what's existing, to work with what's existing, to do the minimum, to just do the right amount of things, to be a little bit boring, to be a little bit mundane, but to act and do the right thing. But I feel like it's a bit of a challenge to the egos of architects, and I was wondering if you had a bit more to say, like, is there another source where to draw this ego from? How could we change this mentality?
Smash it to pieces. I mean, I don't know. I think, again, maybe we have something to learn from other professions. And maybe, the quote on difference without separability. I mean, yes, everyone has an ego, and this isn't to delete one's personal value or participation into something, but it can't be the one and only driving force to something. To your previous point, I mean, it's not me putting a challenge to the young generation. It's the challenge is out there. And I think one thing that happens, what I think that, I don't know that any previous generation has carried such a burden as your guys' generation is. Yes, in terms of violence and inequality, maybe, but also not with these new weapons and exposure to information and all these additional tools that we kind of keep on throwing onto each other. So I don't necessarily envy that. However, I think that also makes you more aware, more exposed, more open to things that my generation never was. By comparison, I grew up under a rock called Rešica, which I love, but it was very different in terms of exposure to informational conversations that we would just not have to this time. One thing that I'd never understand, it's a bit different in Romania, I'm not saying it's the same thing, but at an international level, for some reason, one thing no one ever tells you is that the main ingredient, or one of the main things in becoming this star architect, or like it's a highly successful individual, whatever, architect, is not just the talent, and it's not just the school that you went to, but it's actually independent wealth, or being financially independent. For some odd reason, no one actually talks about this or ever tells people that, as if it's, and which I think the reason is because it's so implicit. And it took me a while to understand that, living in the States, for example, or in other places, like, how do you make a living out of nothing? And that's when you understand how that happens. And the only reason I'm saying that doesn't make it necessarily bad, but I think it's so important to be aware of those things, because there's no point in comparing yourself with, I don't know, someone in Switzerland, where you can, like, even the US versus Switzerland, in Switzerland you can pick the shade of concrete, not the color, the shade, the exact nuance, kind of like makeup shade by skin. So whereas in the States you can, like, you have to fire 5 contractors to get a basic kind of quality concrete. So I think we kind of keep looking at these images and look at things without fully understanding maybe the effort or value behind some of those things, or how we got to them. So I think that's where the risk or the problem is with the baggage or the myths that we inherit in that way, is that we don't fully understand the kind of context that we come from. I also think kind of just pursuing this notion of the individual star architect or whatever, by all means, to each their own, everyone has to make their own choices. But to me, at this moment, it's just not something particularly interesting, and I think it's something that will lead to oblivion. It's just not really what's necessary right now out there. A church, which I know, ironically, apparently we're getting another one. But I think what I'm trying to say is your generation is so different than any previous generation. That's both very hard and super exciting. In many ways, no one can tell you shit. No one has grown up with the tools that you have. Like, I mean, I barely had email in high school. the internet was not what it was today, and you don't see the difference because to you it's innate. You don't see your own, how unique your perspective is because it's yours. But the gap between you and the previous generation is just widening and widening and widening. And it's not driven as much by age as by kind of openness. So I think your generation is confronted with this change and doesn't really have much choice there, for better or worse. That's why I find, for example, in education, to me, one of the most important things to teach, or you have to teach, I don't know that I can teach architecture. You have to be there to just help people think on their own. Many other fields do that innately. That's what they do. That happens maybe in the arts, it can happen in IT or in other worlds where you have to kind of, do some of that, innovate in certain ways. In architecture, I feel we still very often teach, it's almost like training soldiers, training people to then get out into a field, go get a job, work for 30 years, and then become architects. Which that luxury of that kind of life does not exist for the current generations or in the current climate. So I think the most important sort of, not even skill set, sort of thing to navigate these very, very, very trying times is to be able to think for oneself and hold one's balance within these kind of ups and downs that the world is throwing towards us. Maybe it's too existentialist, maybe it's too abstract, but I feel, I don't know what else there is really.
Thank you.
I haven't really spoken much to ego, but...
Okay, so hi. I think your process was very interesting, and it describes maybe the intellectual process of coming up with an idea, which is opposed to the process of being very creative. And then, of course, this raises the next question, which is how do you decide what to cover? And I think this is once you stop thinking about the creation process as being very original and always finding the new idea, and you start thinking through references, then it puts those references into a different light, and it gives one much more importance, and you become much more responsible about what references you choose and how you interpret them in your work. So I think, for me at least, the takeaway from this presentation is like, how do you choose what to cover, and how do you choose what is valuable? Because of course there's always this funny interaction, about the client who wants you to cover, wants you to build a house that looks like in Greece, but you want to build a house that looks like in Austria. And then they're both covers, but whose cover is more relevant, or whose cover is right, so to say. So the question becomes I think it's very relevant for the students, but also for us practicing architects or designers, is how do we choose what is important for any given situation?
Thanks for saying that. I mean, I think it is, in that sense, about the value system and where do we put the value of architecture, right? Do we put it in a quote-unquote style in a photography or in... And again, it's, I think, to each for own. I don't think it's my role to actually say this is a cover or this isn't a cover or what it means to cover. I think really it was and I'm not using it as a cop-out, but it is really more raising these questions that I think people have to answer for themselves. It's not didactic. I'm not didactic to that end. I would never, assume this role of telling someone what to do. I think that's highly irresponsible to have I think there's Robert Irvin says it's irresponsible to have ambitions for someone else's mind. And so it's more important to kind of create a safe place to play and to experiment and to test things so you can discover for yourself or kind of declare for yourself, this is what I care about. And I think to the other, it wasn't yours, but early to the previous point on architecture, I feel, for me, like I said, architecture is in every single part of this exhibition and building, but also it's hard for me to talk about architecture when the foundation isn't clear, when it's not clear of where do we actually meet as people, what is important to us right now, everyone, right? And sort of that's why I think I'm raising some of these questions, whether it's about the forests and the plans and the EU regulations or whatever, because I think that inherently there is maybe a criticism, or there's a looking away from the typical kind of conversations and trying to see, to kind of ask ourselves some questions that go beyond the surface level and kind of come back to the values that you pointed towards. Thanks for saying that. And thanks for helping with the many things you helped with.
You made a lot of comparison to music. You feel like in recent years of human civilization, like the trend in architecture goes like the trend in beats, sort of. So we get bored after a while of some buildings. And
I mean, I'm not smart enough to speak to that, to understand music enough or to make that kind of analogy, but I'm sure there's, you know what I find interesting about music is that it's the fastest to reflect the spirit of the streets, right? It's kind of music and then fashion and art and architecture kind of, right? Like the Centre Pompidou got born out of the student protest in 1968, but it was built 10 years later in a very different sort of context. Like we just coexist in very different times. But I think there's always interesting things to be learned at. And I mean, you know, there's popular music, there's things that happen in music, the waves that come and go. And of course, the kind of TikTokification of songs being only a certain the duration and those kind of things. But maybe another aspect that interests me in music, it is a parallel to architecture. It is the excuse of getting people together. So sort of clubs or spaces of gathering are historically been kind of ignored or seen as secondary, right? Not spaces of value, but it's really typically where youth exists and where entire movements are being born from at a cultural level, and they will influence architecture as well, but it always kind of takes a lot more time till it comes back in there. So I can't speak, unfortunately, but if you have any insight into that, I'm happy to learn more.
I don't have a question. I just maybe have an observation as an art historian. I'm not. I'm a part-time musician. I do think it's nice that music links up with architecture history, because you have, like, I don't know, you can probably link up Bach type beats to old floral looking buildings and then move into contemporary music, which is more simple and looks like sounds and looks like an Excel sheet if you break it down in waveform, which is what the buildings started to look like at the same time. So I think it's nice that music reacts to architecture as well. Like, musicians will react to their living condition, and the music will later influence architects like you in their process. So there is a cover cycle going on. I don't know if it's a more recently evident one, but yeah. I don't really have a question, sorry.
No, but I can speak a little bit to it, and thank you for that completion in a way or like continuing the conversation. I mean, I think everyone who's in a creative field will be jealous of musicians, always, because it's the most immersive art form or thing ever, right? They always talk about immersivity with VR or whatever. I always get motion sickness, so I don't really get it. But music happens inside of you. Like, there's really nothing more immersive than music and sound. And the music's ability to squeeze something out of someone is incredible, right? And so there is always, I don't know if this jealousy, but it's always so moving to encounter, when you encounter that song that you love, it just does things to you that nothing else can, right? It's a refuge, it's a consolation, it's joy, it's sadness, and so on and so forth. Yes, please.
Maybe because it's the fastest art to come out of someone. It's just, even painting or I don't know, quicker arts takes some time to
I mean, voodoo took 5 years.
Get a result. Sorry?
Voodoo, the album, took 5 years, for example. I think it depends
Yeah,
on...
but I mean, in initial state, you can improvise, and even the improvisation can be of some consequence, because it can give birth to the 5-year process or 4-year process that gets the finished product.
I think it's also interesting what you're saying in terms of there being, I mean, I'm misreading probably some of the things you're saying in terms of feeling it, part of it happens because it is also just done by a human in a human way, if that makes sense, by playing instruments, or I'm sure there can be a whole theory about what kind of music speaks to what, but of course beats and techno and EDM and all these things being tied to the heartbeat and again happening within you, and I think we've all experienced some of that. You can experience it on Saturday at the club too. Ouch Collective and James Messiah. Please join us. But the last thing I was going to say is when I taught the studio at UCLA in spring, the students had to find a cover and then illustrate, somehow visualize the difference between the original and the cover they identified, right? And then from there they had to do the case study houses, they had to redraw them, there's some detective work in that. But there was a lot of entire conversation, and then they had to make a cover of this. The question came up, what is really a cover? How is a cover different than a reference image or a precedent, which is the word that you typically use in architecture? And then one of the students said, typically when we talk about precedents, we don't talk about feelings. And I thought that was so beautiful and telling, and in a way, you know, I think these students for the first time, and these were about to graduate at UCLA, so it's like master course, their last semester, quarter, and in a way, because it started with music and it started with a vibe in a way, or with something that they were responding to emotionally, or however you respond to music, they felt allowed, they felt they had permission to talk about feelings within architecture, which they just haven't had in their education up until that point. And not to necessarily be that person who is all about feelings. But I think there is, and I think that's why I read the Ethel Adnan quote too, is we're so hyper-rational right now, and there is this pressure to have an answer, to flatten the world to 120 characters of here's the answer to everything, that I think we need to trust our bodies a little bit more and our instincts a little bit more. And I find architecture education breeds a lot of insecurity. The profession has a lot of insecurity, which we're then giving further to the future generations. And that really, I think to your point and the next generation, I think all you have is your own way of looking at the world and thinking at the world. And the generations right now cannot tell you, we've been through COVID, the impossible is possible, but you can also tell that no one has their pants on. And in a way, I think that's terrifying, but in the same time, it's wildly exciting, because in a way, I think it frees you of some of the burdens that we otherwise inherit a little bit.
I would like to have a last question, if that's okay with everybody. If there is some other questions,
and then drinks. And
then drinks, exactly. First of all, Oana, I think I want to thank you. And I think I'm sure it's going to be in the name of the team as well. But thank you so much for accepting to be the curator of Beta 2024, for accepting our invitation and for offering us this fantastic, inspiring opportunity and process, which I think was extremely heartwarming for everybody involved. And I would like to know how, because from time to time I go back to our initial conversations, I'm very curious, how do you feel now? And how do you think this role of being curator was for you? And how does it, how was it? How do you think it had an impact on you? Or maybe it's too soon to think about it, but I'm curious, how do you feel about it?
I mean, we're 10 days in? This is just a kind reminder, we have 5 more weeks to go. I think the whole team is like, 5 more weeks. It feels already like a century. But a great century to that end. I mean, I don't know, I'm trying to come to terms with it in the sense of, I've been working for so long in architecture, and I came through practice, and then living abroad kind of opens the world a little bit more to doing different things. And one thing that I learned abroad was really the value of cultural production. We're very cynical here. And in a way, we're like, oh, if it's not built, if it doesn't exist, in a way, I think we dismiss very easily people just trying things, just doing things, things existing in these different realms. So I'm trying, I always feel the obvious things I learned through a hard way, but I've been learning the value of cultural production, meaning, yes, some things are built or some things you can experience, but also what happens outside of that, the value of writing and the value of all these other things that don't necessarily exist or can be commodified either. And try to embrace that, and I think exist a little bit more in that realm maybe. So to that end, I think on the one hand, I feel I enjoyed almost too much this entire process. It feels suspicious to me. I was like, really? Which has been incredible, and this is really thanks to the absolutely entire team, which has been, I think that experience I didn't necessarily expect. I didn't expect to want to be here for the 6 weeks or even imagine necessarily what this is. But then it became important to me, you know, we're calling out the hypocrisy, not directly, indirectly. I think we're calling out a lot of hypocrisies in many different areas. I think you also, if you wanted to preach something, you have to show up there and be there. So if we're talking about togetherness and collectivity, I have a role to play, or we all have a role to play, and that also means, yes, being here and seeing it through, and not just putting it in the world and then kind of leaving. So I kind of wanted to live up to it too, which I don't think it's necessarily something. I think the hardest thing. It's strange because you're very exposed in the same time, but the experience and the team have made things incredible for me. From having Chris and Amanda here, to the entire local team, to be joined by Simina Marin, who I met at Harvard, but is from Romania, and then by Chase. And there's all this kind of almost like stars on the sky of people that you encounter throughout, and it all comes together in a place where I studied, and I haven't spent much time on in a lot of time. I'm a lot more excited about Timișoara or Romania in general than about most of the Western world. There's freedom and possibility here that just doesn't exist out there anymore, and we don't see it. And I'm seeing, or I'm recognizing some of that in some of the conversation or feedback that comes back from the exhibition. The most questions have been asked about the rugs and the furniture. And they ask us like, how were you not afraid to put these objects with this baggage in the exhibition? And I'm like, how has this less baggage than an IKEA chair that's been done out of our own forest here? And I understand where that comes from. I understand that we still are afraid to look at ourselves, to understand ourselves, to value these things that are done out of a single piece of wood, without any metal, and so on and so forth. Like, this is design, this is architecture, and in a way we've been doing it for a long time. But I think there's interesting things there that I'm learning both about myself and the place. So I'm not avoiding your question, I'm just still processing. I enjoyed it a lot, and I was telling also, I think Chris at one point again, that is like, it's so strange to put such an effort, especially these last weeks, into other people's work. But in a way, it's maybe easier than putting it into yours specifically too, because there's a emotional distance. Like, you try your best, but you also have to, meet a spreadsheet somewhere and make some cuts, and you just don't have those emotional ties. It's something I've been enjoying, and I've been enjoying the conversations with the artists, with the architects, with the team, and kind of it is deeply collaborative. And then the sharing, I think I've had less anxiety or stress with this than with anything else, because I felt it was such a shared sort of effort that wasn't hinging on a single thing, that I felt like, oh, we all sort of must believe enough in this that it will get somewhere. I did believe that the vibe and the energy within the team will sort of translate, hopefully, in the space, and some of that goes a little bit further too. But I'm not sure necessarily what this will mean for me moving forward. I think it's a reflection of how I've been trying to work already for a few years. But of course, it's hard within private practice, and it's hard within institutions, because neither of those two really kind of enable or invite one to do something like this. So I think, again, with regards to the future and how we work and who we are, I think those are the questions to me. Can we find spaces that are in between, that are between institutions, which also are really just different types of factories, and between private practice that also is very much depending on a private world, and find, like, in a way, I was like, can we sell ourselves as the Biennale Ambulante or something? Can we travel the world like a circus and sort of just set up biennials here and there or whatever? I don't know. But I think there's there's immense that I've been taking from this. So thank you to everyone, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for having me so generously and for coming tonight after a year of hearing me talk about this. Drinks.